Welcome to The Wave, we are Voices of Ecology, a movement powered by the European Union ERASMUS Plus program. Wave brings youth voices to the forefront, from real-life interviews with youth in the eco-village movement to exploring the growth in youth perspectives on intergenerational fairness. We are a multi-host podcast where each episode is unique and is hosted by a different Wave participant. With a rotating format, a diversity of voices, perspectives and passions, Wave brings them all to the mic. Join us as we dive into bold conversations, share inspiring stories, and explore how we can all lead more sustainably.
And hello, everyone. Joining us today is Anna Romanovych, a PhD candidate studying subjects of ecocide, eco-justice, and environmental damages caused during the war, with a focus on Ukraine. Hi, Anna. Thanks for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, so I'm Anna Romanovych. I'm a PhD candidate, as mentioned, in University of Padova in Italy. I'm Kyivan. I'm Ukrainian. I am a patriot of my country, and I'm very passionate about the environment. So this is briefly about me. Yeah.
And thanks so much for taking the time today to join us. As you said, you're right now a PhD candidate. What inspired you to pursue your PhD? And can you tell us a bit about your subject?
So yeah, I'm doing PhD on the subject which is called Eco-Justice in Action, a study of the framework for addressing ecocide and climate change in the conflict-affected areas based on the case study of Ukraine. And actually, it's a continuation of my study. I wrote master's thesis on the similar subject. It was about environmental damages caused to Ukrainian environment by Russia by full-scale invasion of 2022. And it is only natural to continue going deeper into that. So this is why I'm doing the PhD that I'm currently doing, and mainly only for this subject.
Okay, so it was really a subject-led decision for you to do this PhD.
Yeah, I would say it's like a passion project almost, because eventually you when you're very passionate about something, you really want to continue investigating it. So I would say it's passion-driven research.
And I think passion-driven research makes for the best research. So I think that even from the title already, there's a couple of terms that we can dive into. When you say eco-justice in action, of course, eco-justice, that is made up of many parts. Do you want to explain to us what you see as eco-justice in action?
I think it's somehow related to getting the justice for the environment per se. Maybe it's coming slightly from philosophical point of view, where humanity got detached from the nature and environment at some point. And actually we can see this drastic change in the way how our economic systems are built, our economic activity is built. And so the question is, why do we only treat environment from the point of how much value we put into it as human, while it was there way before us and it will stay here way after we're gone? So I guess the question is about if we are able to treat nature fairly and environment fairly and other species as well. And so I think it is coming from this perspective that we do need to protect nature from ourselves in a way, because we are the most invasive species on planet so far. So it is a question both about how do we protect the nature for our own sake as humanity, because at the end of the day, we're quite egocentric as a species. And then other question is about how do we protect the environment from us, and what is just for the nature, what is just for our planet to experience. So it's revolving around these ideas. I feel this is how I got into this title about eco-justice per se. And so I investigated a bit further, and hopefully soon I'm going to be able also to publish my literature review on this matter.
Very interesting. And so the latter part of the title, a study of the framework for addressing ecocide and climate change, before we get to the specific conflict in conflict-affected areas based on the case study of Ukraine. What did you find? Were there frameworks available already?
It's a good question, because at this point ecocide as such, it could be characterized either as severe destruction of the environment that has long-lasting consequences. But overall, ecocide is such a legal term; it doesn't really exist yet. So it's been put in motion, I believe, since Vietnam War, and it was not yet adopted. So from 1970s, more or less, and then it never have been adopted as such. So there's a lot of polemic about what is ecocide and what can we actually call ecocide, what substitutes it. And and there were studies about how do you do recovery of the territory per se, but we don't talk about what if we, in theory, say that the crime against actually whatever we do against the nature which is damaged is a crime. So maybe we'll call it ecocide, maybe we'll call it something else, but let's say ecocide. How do we recover from the crimes that we cause to the nature and to the environment that could be severe and long lasting? So I would say that I didn't come across particular framework which addressed ecocide per se, because I think it's still developing, and there are a lot of different cases of people trying to understand what kind of laws to put in place and what kind of procedures of accountability should be in place for environmental damages. But I would not say that there is yet something comprehensive, because the term itself is not set in stone. And that's why I'm interested to understand, can we say in this theoretical framework that there is an ecocide in Ukraine? So Russia is causing ecocide to Ukrainian environment. And if so, what are the areas that could be classified as ecocide? And what are the areas that are classified like the areas damaged by the invasion that are expected to be damaged, because this is the way how war goes. So for me, the differentiation is interesting. For the sake of justice, particularly. So when we talk about reparation, reconstruction projects, and overall, for the sake of understanding if we can actually set it up as international crime, that some people would like to add to Rome Statute as a crime against humanity, the ecocide.
Yeah.
I'm walking around it and trying to understand in a practical case if it's feasible, if we can do this, if there is a way how we can do it in a modern society.
And so what I think is interesting is that you have as a framework for addressing ecocide and climate change. And I think that ecocide as a term, as you say, it's like been up and coming for a long time, and it has been gaining some ground, especially recently. I know that there is pushes, as you said, to also have ecocide be a legally defined crime. How do you see the difference between ecocide and climate change? And I'm also asking that for the people listening that might not know exactly what ecocide is.
Yeah, so I see it, me and my supervisor may have discussed it already as well recently. It's an interesting question in the terms that I see it like this. We are humans, we are part of the species, and our presence have certain impact on the planet, on the climate, on the environment. And since we are main driver of the changes to the planet, both for climate change and ecocide, it means that there is a framework of how we should actually treat human action to its environment, and not to mess up environment and nature being exactly the same thing. So nature could be basically, it's also a bit about how you define things, but per se environment could be anything that surrounds us. We can be sitting in our rooms now and we're in particular environment. And even the fact that we call it environment in a lot of ministry works, or let's say in our legal documents, the fact that we call nature environment also means that we as a humanity perceive it like just something that surrounds us, while nature is everything that they officially in the vocabulary, they say that nature is anything that is not touched by humanity. So basically it could be forest, trees, birds, plants, etc., something that was not man-made. And it's interesting that we perceive it this way. And so climate change, since it's human-driven, same like ecocide is mainly human-driven. And when we talk about ecocide, it's about, so, climate change is when we basically impacted the environment by our CO2 emissions that are produced by our economic activity. we have impacted the climate to change. So we have created this particular amount of CO2 emissions that heated the planet. And so now we see the consequences and so-called tipping points where we cross the boundaries of the safe existence for all the species. And climate change is a good example of this tipping point that was studied extensively by Rockstrom and Langton and Gupta, where they discuss about what are the safe and just boundaries for planetary existence. And climate change is contributing significantly to us surpassing all of the safe and just boundaries for other species as well. And same goes with Ecocide. It even seems extremer because it's in the terms of usually it's man-driven conflicts. So we have war. There is one side which are human versus another side who are also human, fighting on the territory which we privatized, saying that it's national territory, belongs to us. And then somehow to punish one side, another side can bomb the forest. Yet the question is, why would this extensive destruction be considered normal or fair, especially in this whole framework that we're discussing about intergenerational equity? It's exactly, it's very, very interconnected and complex. And I hope I get through the idea that it's not as simple to answer. But ecocide is man-driven and climate change is man-driven. And ultimately, both of them, though they impact various aspects of the safe and just planetary boundaries for existence, they actually prompt these tipping points and pressure points that could hypothetically destroy the life as we know it and actually be damaging for other species. And it's gonna be something that will last for generations to come, which is horrible and scary to think about, but this is where we are at now.
Yeah. And I fully agree with you. And that's also a reason why we're sitting here talking about this, that these topics are incredibly complex and always interconnected. In the same way that seeing ourselves as outside of nature is also something that's very typical of humans, while we are also just as much part of it, if you were to take a different approach. Let me see if I understood well. I think that how I see it, and also with your explanation, is that the difference is that with an ecocide, it is really in the context of people doing it intentionally with harm in mind. And is also what we would then argue for this to be a crime. Like what Russia is doing in some areas in Ukraine.
Yeah. This is a question about the intention, because the problem is the only instruments we have of nature protection at this particular point is the law. So whatever is in international law to protect the environment. And there are not so many things set in stone in order to do so. And so the problem is, since our law is pretty anthropocentric and it's just revolving around the idea of human presence, and no matter what we think, when we think about, there are some nature rights, let's say in Ecuador, when we talk about the rights of the rivers, or we talk about New Zealand and the rights of particular places, don't be mistaken, they're still revolving around human rights, so indigenous rights, about nature protection. And since the international law is pretty anthropocentric at its core, because it's made by us and it's made for us to serve our interests, this is exactly the issue with ecocide definition, because in our so far very, very short provision of international law, it just says that intentional severe destruction of the nature with knowledge of severe impacts could be considered to be excessive and, let's say, being able to be prosecuted. But the problem is that this idea of having to prove the intention or knowing about the long-lasting consequences is deeply disturbing, because you may find a way around it. Like in a lot of processes that we have legally, people can avoid responsibility by claiming that they didn't know the consequence. So maybe they will have a punishment, but they will not be actually punished, or not punished, but maybe held accountable for their actions to the extent that the case deserves. And so ecocide, people who want to put ecocide as a crime want to make sure that it's going to be criminalized to do something that's severe against the environment, whether at the peacetime or at the time of the war. So this is a big difference, let's say, to try to push for it, because there is national legislation in place in every country that is supposed to protect the environment. But Ecocide is meant to protect the environment for all, or more like for future generations, let's say, from this aspect. And this is why it's so interesting, yet it's not clear where it's going to go. So hopefully in the next few months, we're going to see more developments. But it gains momentum again. So historically, we constantly keep on coming back to this idea. We should try to prevent somehow destruction. And Ecocide so far is one of these great ideas that people try to carry through somehow. Yeah.
No, thank you for that explanation. And so in the Ukrainian context specifically, we see the importance of also taking into account future generations. Could you talk a little bit of why this is particularly relevant now, during, and hopefully soon also after a full-scale invasion and war?
Yeah, if we talk about this idea of intergenerational equity, when we talk, we often bring up this idea about the balancing of the short-term and long-term interests of current generation and future generations. And what is interesting is that overall, in Ukrainian context, it's a bit hard to talk about clean lines. There is no clear definition about what would be just for modern generation versus the future generations, because somehow Ukraine, since 1991, we and our independence, we have dramatically suffered from a lot of interference from other states, notably Russia, which is very well known. And so we have suffered so many horrible things, and previous generations have suffered from the Soviet regime. Modern generations suffer from the war, and the generations of the future will have to suffer from the consequences of the war. And so somehow it's about putting it not only on the national level, but international level, and discussing the consequences of such a devastating event as war in the context of we need to have responsibility for the future generations. And it means that it's not only Ukrainians who have to care about it, but it also Europeans, so our neighbors, our partners, have to also be mindful and thoughtful about that we share the same continent, and therefore whatever is happening in Ukraine now will have consequences, and already has consequences on Europe, and it's going to keep on having consequences on it and the future generations as well. And so I think this idea, and we really need to put this discussion in motion to talk about the justice between the generations, and understanding basically exactly what we discussed, the way how we can make sure that the future will be better than what it is now. And we need to start mitigating the impacts of the war already. So it's something that now the modern generations kind of owe to the future generations, to be sure that we do as much as we can now to prevent the destruction that will be devastating for the future generations. And I was preparing for this talk, and I was trying to find, as suggested, some historical example. What we basically can count like a good example why we should care about the war in Ukraine now from environmental perspective. And first thing that comes to mind is Chernobyl and the tragedy that happened back then. It seemed to be like a nuclear accident that you would nowadays we know it like one of the most tragic the one most tragic events happened in Europe in a while. But back in time, there was when the nuclear reactor have exploded, the consequences of just this explosion alone were very severe. And I just give a small recap about that. Chernobyl is a small Ukrainian city which is located next to the border to Belarus and basically somewhere nearby borders of Russia. And at the time, when on 26th of April 1986, the reactor have exploded. the consequences of this nuclear waste settling around on the territories of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia have actually been severe. So there were so many people who have died, and they estimate by this time 8.5 million people have been affected by this nuclear disaster. And at the time, the impacts that were mitigated, there were a lot of discussions during 3 days. The tragedy of it was that during 3 days after the explosion, back at time, Soviet government didn't tell everybody the real consequences that this explosion had on their health, on the environment, and how actually dangerous it was to remain in Chernobyl and Pripyat. And so actually some residents started to die. Those who were first responders, the ones who helped to put down the fire and try to clean up the nuclear waste. And I guess you might have heard about this infamous, there's even the episodes called Chernobyl that you can discover a bit more on the fictional side. But it's truly dramatic what happened to the local population. But even worse was the fact that the Soviet government didn't tell the local people about the real consequences of this event on their health. And so for 3 days, people lived as if they lived as if, okay, there was just a fire, and they kept on drinking water. They kept on eating the food that they usually ate, and ultimately they were not prevented from the health and environmental consequences that this event led to. And so many people were affected. And actually, the tragedy is that the future generations keep on being affected. So there is still a status of the person who was affected by Chernobyl tragedy in Ukraine. So there are kids of those who survived Chernobyl and who still have allocated the some discounts to go to sanatorium and to get health treatments, and they actually still get sent to summer camps or to they have access to medical facilities in other countries of Europe to be able to heal from the impacts of radiation that actually left long-term damage to their health and to the health of their kids. And by this day, it's still isolated zone. And so think about this and how horrible it was and how damaging it was to the environment, to the nature. And we all know what were the consequences of it. Imagine now it's being scaled up to the size of the country. So they keep on bombing at this current days. They keep on bombing other nuclear power plants. They destroyed the dam, Kakhovska Dam, and it flooded the area, which was extremely huge, and it killed a lot of animals and birds and other species of. So it overall the scale gets bigger and bigger, and so when we just talk, when we can imagine, let's say, Chernobyl being replicated to the size of the country, and it becomes quite a terrifying idea. And so that's why it's so important to talk about it, because the consequences of this may not be seen by us at this current moment, because we still are yet to discover what are real consequences of this environmental damages that Russia causes now to Ukraine. And then the worst thing is that as soon as the war will be over and hopefully Ukraine will get to finally be independent, sovereign country as we always were, the problem will be still to recover, and most probably the consequences are far worse than we know now. And it comes into this very intricate interplay between how do we as modern generations do fair for the future generations, but also for all these people who are currently forced to live in the conditions that are far beyond healthy and far beyond those that are actually, it would be recommended by WHO, let's say, for exposure to toxic waste that is being left over after shelling or after bombing of let's say, enterprises. So there is a lot to really unwrap on this. And I hope I don't sound too sad about it, let's say too depressive, because there are still ways out. But indeed, we need to start acting. There has to be some movement toward nivelating these damages to try to prevent the spread and make sure to put a precedent for sure, to protect environment, to protect the surrounding.
No, certainly. And I don't think, and I think that also when talking about the climate and emotions and war, and emotions are allowed. We can be sad and still remain hopeful, and see the future that we want to work towards. So, with that in mind, how do you think that young Ukrainians now are being impacted differently than older generations?
Thanks for listening to the Wave podcast. We are Voices of Ecology. Stay tuned and subscribed so you don't miss out on the next episodes. If you are inspired to act, share, and learn more, connect with us. Follow us on Instagram at WaveProjectEU and share the episode with another person today. Every beat helps keep the wave moving forward.